Now let's talk about some more specific validation. So when I reload the page and I just write down here, or write down go, right? So just go, I can add it to the list, but in the end, go is like not a real good task title. And what we should have, let's assume that a task should at least have 4 characters. So at least I need to write down like walk or something like that, right? So for that, we can use another HTML attribute. So let's just switch over. And here in our task list component.html, you can see that we have that. Let me just scroll to the right. Here at the input field, we got the required HTML tag. And we can use another one, which is called min length. There we go, min length. Let's set it to 4. So we at least have to enter 4 digits or characters to make that input field value be valid or be marked as valid from Angular side. So when I go ahead and write down now go, for example, you can see, okay, I get a message, but once I hit 4 characters, you can see that it is gone. Now, what we want to do for sure is to display the correct message. So right now it's saying task title is required, but we are entering something. So we are providing something. So for the user, this error message is misleading. What we want to show instead is like, hey, please enter more characters, or like the task title must be at least 4 characters long or something like that. So you know that from other websites out there and other forms, right? So each validation message could potentially be different, right? So it could be completely empty, or you enter an invalid email address, for example, or you write down a URL instead of an email address. You could really filter all of the different scenarios what a user could mess up in your form. So now I want to show you how you can use 2 error messages and really decide which one to choose based on what the user enters. Let's create our second error message. Let me just zoom out one time just to give you a little bit more or a better overview. So task title, let me just bring that here so that it becomes clear now. Okay, so right now here we got our if statement. So if it's invalid or touched or dirty, we want to show always that task title. But now we want to go ahead and, well, change that. So let's go ahead and write down a div here. And inside that div, we will put that task title is required. Now we only want to show this message here, which is highlighted right now. I will zoom in again now. We only want to show that if the error is the required, or is it coming from the required flag right here, right? So let me just highlight it so that you can see it here. I'm at required. So if this required flag or this boolean is not true, or we have that required error, then we want to show that required message, right? I guess that totally makes sense for you. So let's go ahead and write down here again an if statement. So only show that if the new task has any errors. So this is an like, are there any errors, right? And if there are, we want to check if there is an error which is called required. But we need to put that in single quotes here. There we go. Okay, so let me just explain that again. New task is our input field. And if we have like any sort of validation error, like we don't enter any value, or we set a min length attribute here, and we just enter 2 values, then we have an object called errors. And inside there, you will find like the required error or the min length error, for example. But if you don't have any sort of form mistake or like input mistake, like you really entered a valid value, so a good one, then errors will not be available. And this is why we have to check for the existence, right? Now, task title is required will now only be available if we have an error object, and inside there we can find the required error. Great, so let's copy that over and do exactly the same stuff, but this time not for required. This time we do it for min length. And as I said again, this is coming then from the min length attribute. Now, task title must at least be or have 4 characters, for example, right? So just write down any message you like. Great, so let's start our application. we should now be able to see different values. So if I click here and click outside, you can see task title is required. And if I now start writing down something, for example G, you can see task title must at least have 4 characters, right? So the error message actually changed. And if I write down at least 4 characters, everything is gone. Now, if I completely remove it, you can see task title is required because the required scenario is handled first in our example here. And now if I write down something again, you can see task title must at least have 4 characters. Okay, awesome. And sometimes the validation is not only about what the user enters, sometimes it's also about what we allow the user to enter. So for example, right here in the to-do, I can really write down anything, that's totally fine. That's how it should be, right? But take a look at the date here. Well, actually that's an input field and I can write down hello world. Okay, so for a date input field, well, that's kind of bad, right? So we don't want to show a validation message here. We could go ahead and say, well, date has to be like a real date and not like a name or a string or a number or whatever, right? But we could also go ahead and just use plain HTML or some sort of HTML and Angular to just make sure that the user is only allowed to enter a date value here. So even handle that scenario of showing some error messages, right? So we don't show error messages. Instead, we don't let the user be able to write down wrong content of the input field. So what we want to do in that scenario here, because you're most likely to really pick a date picker very often in your future Angular applications, we don't want to write down here anything. We just want to get it handled by our nice widget that we have right here, because that works fine. So what we want to do is we want to make that field here read only. In your HTML, again, task list component, go ahead and search for the met date picker. It's a little bit, you have to scroll a little bit up, right? And here we got the input field, and we will make that run read only because the value will come from the met date picker. So the user should not be allowed to enter any value right here. So if you take a look at your application now, you can see that if you click on that date input field, you cannot enter any value, but you can still use the date picker to change the value. And that's the desired behavior that we want to have here. So we prevent the user from being able to write down something wrong here. We got a tool for it, it's absolutely fine. The user really should use that widget here. It's way easier to use than just write down the date, so you can just pick it and change the year and all of that instead of writing it down manually and, well, eventually making a lot of mistakes here. So this is also a nice way to, well, make sure that we have some sort of validation here, right? So we got like a passive validation, and here in to-do we got sort of an active validation.